Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our in-house Pureaid food production webinar, Current Practices and Future Improvements. This is Terry Kirkpatrick speaking, and I'm now going to introduce Hilary Dunn, who is co-lead of the Nutrition Community of Practice.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining us today. Leslie Whittington-Carter is also the lead of the Nutrition Community of Practice, but unfortunately she wasn't able to join us today, so I'm here on behalf of her as well. The other organizations that are part of the core working group for this community of practice are our sponsoring agency, which is Dietitians of Canada, the organization that I represent, which is Agri-Food for Healthy Aging. It's a research program that looks at the connections between agriculture, food, and health, and it's part of the Schlegel University of Waterloo Research Institute for Aging. And we also have some members from Ontario Society of Nutrition Management, Registered Nurses Association of Ontario, and also the Personal Support Network of Ontario. So for those of you that don't know much about our COP, our goal is really to link current and future practitioners that are all involved in the nutrition care of older adults, and also to really promote evidence-based nutrition care by supporting knowledge exchange between our members, to disseminate best practices to frontline caregivers, and hopefully today's webinar is a good example of that, and also advocating for more research on food and nutrition issues that are related to older adults. So if you aren't already a member of our Nutrition Community of Practice, please feel free to join, and you can learn more on the Shirton website, which is www.shirton.ca. They are doing a bit of work on the website, but the basic information is still there, and you can always contact Leslie or myself if you have any other questions. So our webinar today, the title is In-House Pureaid Food Production, Current Practices and Future Improvements in Long-Term Care. And we have two speakers with us today. I'm going to introduce them both right at the beginning, and then I will let them take it away. So first we have Dr. Lisa Deiser. She's an assistant professor in the Food Science Department at the University of Guelph, and is a member of the Agri-Food for Healthy Aging Research Group. Prior to beginning her appointment at the university in 2009, she was an associate professor in the School of Nutrition and Dietetics at Acadia University in Nova Scotia, and she was a senior lecturer in food technology at Massey University. Lisa's current research program involves studying the perception of taste and flavors of whole grain products, sodium-reduced products, and then of course the topic for today, pureed foods for older adults with swallowing difficulties. And we also have Neela with us today, who is a master's candidate in the Department of Food Science at the University of Guelph. And she is working with Dr. Deiser, and her research interests include investigating texture modification practices in long-term care and developing formulations for pureed foods that better address the needs of the aging population. Please join me in welcoming Lisa and Neela, and I'm going to pass it over to them. It might just take a second while I get our PowerPoint set up here.
So I'm Lisa, and I'm going to start the presentation and give you an introduction to the topic that we're talking about today, and then I'll pass it over to Neela to specifically discuss the research findings. So what we want to talk to you about today is the research we've been working on looking at pureed food development in long-term care homes, and give you some suggestions on how you might be able to improve formulations if you are making your formulations, and just give you an understanding of some of the current practices and some of the challenges that are occurring. And this project is a collaboration between Schlegel UW Research Institute for Aging and the University of Guelph. So just to start off, I think we're all fairly aware that the prevalence of dysphagia within a population increases as that population ages. And while there are many reasons why people are going to suffer from dysphagia, one of the big reasons for this to happen is because of certain diseases and conditions that become more obvious as we age. For instance, somebody who has had a stroke or has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's or Parkinson's disease are likely to encounter problems with swallowing food, which really is what dysphagia is about. And it's because of behavioral problems, motor problems, or sensory problems with these conditions that lead people not being able to process the food properly and to swallow it. Now, even within a population of individuals that don't have conditions like I described in the previous slide, we can still see that as we age, there are certain changes physiologically that occur to all of us, and they possibly contribute to the development of dysphagia. And we've listed 4 here, which are fairly common in occurrence as we age and can also lead to dysphagia happening. And a big one is xerostomia, which is also known as dry mouth. We have a problem producing enough saliva to be able to mix the food together and swallow the food safely. And this is a particular problem with individuals who are on certain types of medications where it reduces their salivary output, and when they go to put dry food in their mouth and they try to chew it, they're not able to swallow it, and it leads to choking. We also know that as we age, our muscles start to become weaker, and that can also happen to our tongue, and we require our tongue to be able to process food. And if we have lower maximum tongue strength, we're possibly going to encounter some problems swallowing food because the tongue is required to push the food to the back of our mouth for swallowing. We also know that as individuals age, it takes many more muscle movements and different movements of our tongue and our facial muscles to be able to process that food. And so therefore there's a longer time needed to initiate a swallow, which can mean that we may have some problems getting that swallow to actually happen. And lastly, sensory deficits occur. And a big sensory deficit that can happen as we age is an inability to detect the temperature of food. It's easier for us to swallow a food when it's warmer or colder. When it's sitting at body temperature, it becomes more problematic to swallow. And if we have a problem detecting temperature, then that body temperature of the food will make it challenging to swallow it safely. So within individuals, all of us, whether we have dysphagia or not, have 3 different processes that the food goes through to get from the plate into our stomach. And dysphagia can occur at any stage of the swallowing process. And the 3 stages are basically categorized as the oral stage, the pharyngeal stage, and the esophageal stage. And the oral stage is actually further divided up into 2 stages. The preparatory phase occurs even before the food is put in the mouth. This is when we recognize that food is food and that we want to be putting it into our mouth in order to chew it. And dysphagia can even occur at this stage. If we're not mentally prepared to process that food and to start chewing that food when it's placed in our mouth, then we're more likely going to choke on that food because it's a bit of a surprise that it appears there. And this can be problematic for individuals who are not feeding themselves. So if they're not prepared for that food to be placed in the mouth, when it does get put in there by someone who's feeding them, they may start choking because they don't realize that it's actually there. Now, within the transport stage of the oral processing stage, what actually happens in this first box that's labeled oral, we can see that the food, which is in yellow on the picture, is actually classified as a bolus. And what a bolus is, it's broken down food particles that basically break down as we chew. The teeth are responsible for those particle size becoming smaller. The particles become mixed with saliva, and the food is moved through the mouth, basically with the help of the tongue. And when the trigger for swallowing happens, the tongue pushes the food to the back of the mouth and then down the throat. Now, if an individual is suffering from oral dysphagia, you're probably likely, dysphagia at the oral phase, probably what you're seeing is that the food is being pouched and that it's just being put in the cheeks of their mouth and it's not being swallowed. You may actually even notice that the food is falling out of their mouth, that it's not even getting to the back of the mouth, and that's another symptom that perhaps the individual is suffering from dysphagia. Now, from the oral phase, we move to the pharyngeal phase, where the food, which has been pushed to the back of the mouth by the tongue, is starting to move down the pharynx. Now, you'll notice that there's a blue line underneath the yellow bolus in that particular stage, picture of that stage. And that blue line is actually the vocal folds in the epiglottis that are closing the airways off so that the food doesn't travel down the airway and into the lungs. If that happens, that's known as aspiration. Now, from there, in the esophageal stage, the food is pushed further down the esophagus, and the peristaltic waves of the esophagus move it down into the stomach. And another key symptom of dysphagia at this point is if an individual wants to clear their throat all the time, or they feel like there's something lodged in their throat, it may be a sign that they have dysphagia. obviously, because of the various stages of the chewing process, there are a number of risks that somebody with dysphagia may encounter. The big one being aspiration, where, as I said, if the airway is not closed off, the food is actually going to be aspirated into the lungs rather than into the stomach, and it's because of an impairment in the pharyngeal stage of the process. Asphyxiation may also be a large problem, and that's basically because of choking, and there are a large number of deaths that have been associated with asphyxiation of semi-solid foods when older adults eat them. And lastly, pneumonia can also be another major risk of dysphagia, and that's where the aspirated food, when it is sitting in the lungs, leads to pneumonia, and there is a very high attack rate of pneumonia within individuals within long-term care homes. So obviously, we want to try and avoid these risks. We don't want these things happening with older adults or with anybody eating food. And we need to have a goal to ensure that the food is safe for consumption. And so what we're looking for, particularly in long-term care homes, is that we maximize the food intake of individuals while we minimize the risk of choking and aspiration. And there are various strategies that can be used to do this that include developing appropriate textured food, making sure that it's very acceptable from a sensory perspective, and that it has high nutrient quality so that the diet is good and the individual is not going to suffer from malnutrition. Now, in the case of individuals with dysphagia, modified texture foods are basically the common management therapy for individuals that suffer from dysphagia. We know that about 60% of older adults in long-term care have dysphagia. We also know that only about 15 to 20% of individuals in long-term care are on pureed diets, and there are probably a number of individuals who maybe should be consuming a pureed diet who are not. Now, within the pureed food world, there are a number of strategies that you can use to acquire pureed foods. These include purchasing commercial products, and within Canada there are a number of commercial food producers, and we have listed a few here, including Appetito, HFS, Campbell, Lions, Raycare, and we are actually involved with another research project looking at profiling the commercial pureed foods for older adults. Another strategy for modifying the texture of foods is to do it yourself in-house using standardized recipes. These can be acquired from food service providers such as Cisco or GFS, or they may be customized recipes that have been developed in-house. And it is this last in-house production that we want to focus on this afternoon. So the objectives of the remainder of the talk that Mila is going to present to you are basically, we hope that by the end of it you will have an understanding of current practices and challenges regarding in-house purees, and also we're hoping that as a takeaway message you will have an idea of how to create in-house formulations that are safe for consumption and have acceptable textures. So I will turn it over to Mila, and she will talk to you about some findings of some research we've been working on.
Thank you, Lisa. So I'm just going to take over the rest of the presentation. And so in order to understand this first objective about current practices and challenges of in-house pureed food production, we had to go right to the source. So what I did was I went into 25 long-term care homes, and we had interviewed cooks and nutrition managers, and we also conducted observations in the kitchen of cooks preparing pureed foods in their homes. And here are some of the findings from that. What we found was that approximately 88% of homes prepared all of their foods in-house, whereas only about 12% did a little bit of both. So they did, half outsourcing and half in-house. Some did purchase commercial products just as for emergency purposes, and in the case where their food processor breaks down, they can have something there to provide residents who need pureed food. And what we also found was that the most commonly used food processor was a global food mixer. And so we know that in-house pureed food is very common in long-term care. So what we wanted to find out was why these homes are currently making more in-house purees. versus commercial. And some of the provided reasons were that cost was a big factor. So the raw food budget, they're only given about $7.33 per resident per day, and that doesn't give a lot of extra money for purchasing Pureed food, which could often be expensive. Also, there was a regulation from ministry that suggests that the modified texture food must match the regular texture menu as much as possible. And in order to provide the same variety as the regular texture menu, it was important to provide Pureed in-house instead of purchasing, because there just isn't much commercial options out there right now. As well, many nutrition managers and cooks mentioned that in-house Pureed food seeking to provide better quality in terms of taste and nutrition, but interestingly, none of them said texture in terms of better quality. So, and the last point there is to have control over ingredients. So if a resident that was on a Pureed diet was allergic to a certain food ingredient or required specialized foods such as halal or kosher food, they're able to better provide for these residents who require specialized ingredients. And so some of the challenges that we're seeing for in-house Pureed foods is that there seems to be a lack of common language for describing Pureed. And when we had asked nutrition managers and cooks about what is the ideal Pureed food texture, the responses seem to vary quite a bit. So from pudding consistency to holding a shape on a plate and being soft and smooth to nectar and honey. And those two descriptors, nectar and honey, are actually for thickened liquids and they're not appropriate to be used for modified texture foods. So you can see how the varied texture descriptors can lead to varied methods of preparation and also can lead to very varied textural outcomes for Pureed food. The second challenge that we've seen is that there seems to be no objective methods to check the consistency of texture in the kitchens of long-term care homes. Aside some of the cues that you use to achieve the appropriate texture, and most of the responses that were given are not very objective. So the majority of cooks mentioned that they would just eyeball the Pureed food to ensure that it was the right consistency, and very few actually tasted the products to see if it was appropriate. So it's important that we come up with a method to be used in home to check the texture. And the third challenge was stated as the functionality of standardized recipes. There were a few problems with them. Majority of cooks mentioned that the standardized recipes that were given seemed to have inaccurate amounts of liquid or ingredients that led to inconsistent outcomes. So this speaks to the fact that perhaps the standardized recipes should be reviewed on a regular basis, and also an appropriate choice of liquid or ingredients. So one of the examples of this is that at a few homes they had mentioned the bean sprouts incorporated into a stir-fry recipe, and for certain ingredients that is okay to be put on a regular textured diet is not sometimes appropriate to be used in a pureed diet, because when they're being pureed, it just results in a very liquidy product, especially when it is put on top of a steam table. And lastly, the centralized recipes that are given to the homes don't seem to be well suited to the home level. So a lot of cooks and nutrition managers are having to alter these recipes to suit the needs of their residents in the home. And so overall, the nutrition managers and cooks that I had interviewed had mentioned that they would require more guidance, number one, for certain method to reach the appropriate endpoint texture. Secondly, perhaps some garnishing ideas to increase the appeal of pureed foods. And lastly, some substitution ideas for difficult to pureed textures. And lastly, we found that the ministry guidelines for pureed food preparation were sort of variably interpreted. So one of the main guidelines is that modified textured food should follow the regular menu options as much as possible. And there seems to be a little bit of confusion about this guideline, mainly that some nutrition managers and cooks mentioned that they had to provide exactly what the regular textured menus are having. But there are some, and they fear of being cited if they do not follow this regulation. But there are some food items that are, when being pureed, are much more difficult and result in it's very hazardous for people who have swallowing difficulties. So they would just like more, I guess, guidance as to, what food textures are appropriate, and if they are not, what are the appropriate substitutions for those difficult to puree textures. And so some future improvements that could be made are some strategies for ensuring safe textures, as well as some strategies to maintain nutritional density. So many dietary staff mentioned that they know that they should minimize the use of thickener and liquid in a pureed item, because having a very liquidy pureed food can lead to aspiration, because the food is going down too fast, and the swallowing reflex is not able to respond in time to protect the airway. As well, there are strategies to ensure acceptable sensory properties. So it's also important, cooks mentioned, that recognizing that food items would be enhanced or diminished in flavor as a result of being pureed. So, for example, pureed liver was reported to be much more enhanced in flavor than odors when it is being pureed. So cooks would use half beef and half liver to compensate for that. And salads are one example that seems to be kind of diminished in flavor when it is being pureed, because the majority of its content is water. And so they reported using, for example, salad dressing, low-fat salad dressing, to kind of enhance the flavor of the puree. So I had made some formulations with the information that I gained from the interviews. We formulated pureed turkey and pureed carrot products, and we wanted to take a look at different factors in the meat and vegetable products to see what the effects on the sensory properties would be. So we used pureed turkey and pureed carrots that were locally sourced, and we had varying treatments, such as added liquid, meat muscle combination, and seasoning application method. So we wanted to see what the effects of these treatments on the sensory properties were. So we trained 10 trained panelists to basically evaluate what the sensory properties in these purees are, and then rate them on a 15, 17 scale. And so when we looked at pureed turkey with varying added liquid, and we used broth in this case, what we found was that the lower added liquid, so small amounts of liquid change result in great differences in texture. Particularly, we can see that with the lower added liquid formulation, 40%, we had greater mouth drying, graininess, and thickness perception. And this could be negative attributes for swallowing. So given these two treatments, perhaps 40% is probably much more ideal to use in formulations. And secondly, we took a look at the difference in using 100% breast meat or 60% breast and 40% thigh meat. And what we found was there's actually no significant differences in the sensory attributes with the different meat muscle types. And these were chosen based on what we observed in the long-term care kitchens of what they would prepare pureed turkey with. And we also looked at the effect of seasoning application. So having a rubbed meat, so that's when the turkey was actually seasoned prior to cooking, so as a rub, versus non-rubbed, which is putting the seasoning into the food processor instead of prior to cooking. And we found that the rubbed meat seemed to have less mouth drying, less graininess, and less thickness, sensory perception, and also greater peppery flavor. And it's been studied that pepper actually has is important for swallowing, could be important for swallowing, in that and the greater peppery flavor perception could enhance the swallowing reflex. So between these choices, the rub was probably a much more optimal formulation to use. And when we looked at the nutrient content of the pureed turkey and kind of compared it with some commercial pureed items that are commercially available out there now, we found that the in-house pureed turkey actually has much significantly greater protein content than those 4 commercial turkeys that we use that are from undisclosed companies for obvious reasons. But yeah, so comparing in-house pureed food to commercial, we can definitely see that there are significant differences in protein content. And when we looked at pureed carrots, we were more interested in looking at the effects of added thickeners on the sensory properties. So we investigated different carrots with different added thickeners. So modified cornstarch was reported to be the most commonly used in the long-term care homes, and everybody has them. And 2 are more experimental and is based on the literature. So baby rice cereal and skim milk powder was added as a 2 other treatments, and they were fortified at 1.6% based on literature. And we could see that from this macronutrient analysis, we actually see a significant difference in the modified thickener, it having greater carbohydrate content, but significantly very little fat. And this is fortified at 1.6%, so perhaps looking at greater fortification levels and seeing if rice cereal and skim milk powder can have enhanced macro and micronutrient properties would be an avenue to further explore. So we're just going to talk about now some recommendations that have been made by the cooks in pureed food production. So here's the table that I have sort of collated based on the responses as to how to make pureed foods better. They had mentioned that mincing the pureed food first before adding the liquid seems to be better for preparing pureed foods. And offering color variety is also important. So it's important because residents as well as staff need to be able to clearly identify what is on their plates. So if you have all balls of pureed food, it's very hard to identify what is the meat, what is the starch. So offering color variety is very important. And also, it was found that for a single scoop of puree, the one color is usually preferred over a mixture of colors. So, for example, when pizza is pureed, it's got lots of colors going on, so that tends to be not as preferred as a single meat or a single hard product. And so recall on slide 18, I had mentioned that nutrition managers and cooks reported needing more guidance for various things. And one of those were some kind of method to kind of tell what the appropriate endpoint texture is. Secondly, the garnishing ideas to increase appeal, and lastly, substitution ideas for those foods that are difficult to puree. And there are some standards that we can take, national standards for modified texture foods that we can take away from. Now, Canada, we don't have our own national texture modified food standards currently. I know that Dietitians of Canada are currently working on getting our own texture modified standard. But USA, UK, Australia, and Ireland all have their own. And the consistent descriptors that are being used in all of these standards are that pureed foods are smooth, they're lump-free, they're cohesive, homogeneous, and they're of pudding-like consistency. So there are a few things that we can take away from those standards, and they do give great examples of what could be used to standardize texture, using, for example, heaping spoon test, spoon immersion, or fork test, and a line spread test. And this picture here is an example of a line spread test where food would be put in a hollow tube, and the tube would be lifted, and the product will be allowed to flow for 1 minute, and the distance will be measured. So these are just some ideas that could be adopted in long-term care homes in Ontario, but again, significant research has to be done on this to see if it is even feasible to be used in long-term care homes. And secondly, the garnishing ideas that cooks and nutrition managers have told me through the interviews is that was the following. And notice that because pureed foods needs to be of a homogeneous consistency, so that means that there can't be two different consistencies being served. You can see most of the common garnishing items that are being used are of semi-liquid consistencies, and thicker gravy, pureed cream, celery soup, for example, and condiments. And so that's very important to maintaining homogeneous consistency to serve to residents, especially with swallowing difficulties. And lastly, there are ideas for difficult to puree food items that cooks and nutrition managers had come up with. And again, I've collated them in sort of 3 tables, and I have kind of grouped them by food type and the reasons for the difficulties of these food groups. And for vegetables, some of the problems is that, they can be stringy, they can have seeds, skins, and husks. And so it's important to process, for example, peas for longer periods of time to kind of break down the skins or husks. And if that doesn't seem to be working, an alternative method could be to use softer canned vegetables. Now, keep in mind that canned vegetables might alter the color a bit when comparing to non-canned vegetables. And fruits tend to be much more liquidy when they're pureed, so thickening is often being done with pureed fruit, or substituting with things like applesauce. And meats can be very fibrous, and when pureed, they can be clumpy, like certain things like liver, like I mentioned before. So many nutrition managers and cooks seem to use meat rolls, and they seem to be easier to puree. And the last column there, or row there, is that the list of foods. Cheese could be pureed. Cottage cheese is a great example of the cheese that could be pureed. But all the other food items that are listed on that table should be prohibited at all times for people who have swallowing difficulties. And lastly, starches can have a very pasty and thicker quality to them when pureed and then left on a steam table, for example, so you want to really be careful with that. So ensuring that, for example, pastas are cooked for longer periods of time instead of making risotto pasta. So yeah, those were some of the findings of the interviews that I conducted. And in summary, there's definitely still a lot of challenges in the production of in-house pureed foods to date. And part of the difficulties and the challenges that are being faced is because we really don't have any objective standards to follow. And descriptors that are provided in those other national guidelines are very qualitative descriptors. So perhaps coming up with a method to using more quantitative descriptors would be ideal. And it's important to also ensure that the pureed foods are both look and taste appealing. And some kind of future directions as to in-house production. Some quality checks are definitely needed in reaching some, and they should be tested and trialed, obviously, to see if it's even feasible to be used. Because what I found from the interviews is that cooks really didn't have a lot of time to prepare everything that they needed to prepare. So something quick, efficient, but objective as well is definitely needed. And trialing the recipes in long-term care, making sure that there are controlled taste tests that are being done, and having both nutrition managers and cooks, sitting down and actually tasting the pureed product is definitely an avenue that we should all be moving towards. And it's really important to basically have relevant professionals collaborate in terms of what we can do to make pureed food better, and then also quantitative measures for safety. And that concludes our presentation. And here are some acknowledgements. I want to just thank all the nutrition managers and cooks that had participated in the interviews a while back ago, and your input was definitely appreciated. And Ontario Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association for providing the carrots that we needed for this project, and Turkey Farmers of Ontario as well, and of course Schlegel. I'll pass it back to Helena.
Well, if we don't have any questions, I will say that the research team did put together a tech transfer document, and it does give the recipes that Neela had put together, and that is available on the AHA website, and we can send a link to that out to everyone after the webinar. But it does provide a really nice summary of the project, and we have it available online, but if you do need in-print copies, then you can feel free to request them from me. And also, for those of you that are members of the Canadian Society of Nutrition Management and you wish to receive 2 continuing education points for participation, it would be 1 point under the Nutrition and Healthy Living section and 1 point under Food Services Systems Management. So you can send me an email with your registration number, and then I'll be able to compare it to our participant list, and then I can send it off to CSNM in order for you to redeem those education points.
Are there any resources available or future research on pureed foods at home for home care?
This is Lisa. I don't know of any research that is ongoing with regard to pureed foods for home care, but the document, the tech transfer document that Hillary mentioned would be a good start, because it outlines recipes that could be made. You might have to scale them down. They may be too large unless you have a very large family. But it also provides some tips on things to think about. So it would be worthwhile to take a look at that document. And then if there are any questions after that, you can email either Neela or I, and we could follow up with a discussion on things that could be done.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa and Neela, for presenting. It was great. It was very informative. And I think it really highlights an area that is really in need of research, so it's great that you guys are working in this area. And I'd also like to thank the Canadian Agricultural Adaptation Program who provided the Research Institute for Aging with funding in order for us to move this project forward. So we're of course very grateful for that. And also to, of course, Terry and Shurton, because they're very supportive of our nutrition community of practice. And without their help, we wouldn't be able to run webinars like this. So thank you very much. And if you have any further questions, please feel free to email me with the email up on the screen. Thanks.